The smell found Thomas first, a sharp, acrid bite that clawed at the back of his throat, even through the haze. It was the smell of things that should not burning, wood and wool and paint, yes, but also something deeper, sweeter, like cooked meat gone wrong, and underneath it all, the metallic tang of blood. He lay on his side, pressed into the cool, damp earth, his cheek sticky with something that wasn't mud. When he tried to move, a dull ache pulsed through his left arm and the side of his head. Slowly, carefully, he pushed himself up onto trembling hands and knees. The world swam, colors bleeding into each other. He squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for it to pass, the terrible smell filling his head. When he opened them again, the colors were still wrong, but sharper now. Red and orange flickered against a sky bruised purple into nightfall. Smoke rolled in thick, greasy waves, clinging low to the ground. It coiled around things he recognized, or half-recognized, distorting them into monstrous shapes. He was outside the root cellar, the one his mother had pulled him into just minutes, hours, a lifetime ago. He remembered the press of her body, the urgent whisper. "Stay quiet, Thomas. Don't make a sound," and then a different sound, a tearing, choked-off cry, and the sudden, terrible absence of her weight. Now the cellar door was ripped open, splintered wood gaping like a wound. The village was gone. Not gone in distance, but gone in substance. Where cabins had stood, where the general store with its jars of boiled sweets had been, where the smithy's hammer had rung just that morning, now there were only skeletal frames silhouetted against the flames. Piles of smoldering rubble, and the eerie, unsettling silence that follows unimaginable noise. The screams, the shouts, the frantic cries of animals, all silenced. Only the crackle of fire and the sigh of the wind through the ruins remained. Thomas, 7 years old, stared at the desolation. The sticky wetness on his cheek felt cold now. He touched it with a tentative finger, brought the finger to his face. It was dark, almost black in the flickering light, but it felt like jelly. The smell from his finger was the same sweet, wrong smell he couldn't place. He looked at the dark streak on his hand, and a different kind of cold seeped into his bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the night air. He was alone. The world was ash and embers. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the haze of shock and grief. It urged him to run, blindly, anywhere away from the terrible quiet. He scrambled away from the root cellar, stumbling over debris, his bare legs snagging on sharp edges. He didn't look back at the burning village, didn't look for any sign of anyone. His small legs pumped, carrying him across the scarred earth towards the dark line of trees at the edge of the clearing. The wind howled around him, a mournful sound that seemed to echo the cry trapped in his own chest. It felt like the land itself grieved with him. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs ached, the fear a relentless spur. He didn't know where he was going, only that it had to be away. The woods swallowed the last of the firelight, plunging him into a darkness made deeper by the fading glow behind him. Twigs snapped underfoot, leaves rustled, every sound a potential threat in the sudden, absolute silence of the forest. He tripped, falling hard onto the leaf-strewn ground, scraping his hands and knees. The pain was distant, a small thing compared to the vast, aching emptiness inside him. He lay there, sobbing, his body racked with a grief too large for him to comprehend. His mother's face, laughing as she braided his hair, his father's strong hand showing him how to whittle wood, the neighbor's dog, always happy to see him, all gone, vanished in smoke and fire. A sound cut through his sobs, a grunt, low, pained, close by. Thomas froze, his breath catching in his throat. He held himself still, straining his ears. Another sound, a rustle of leaves, a soft groan. It wasn't an animal. Animals didn't groan like that. Terror, fresh and sharp, flooded him. Had someone survived? Or were they still here, the attackers? He remembered the flashes of movement, the painted faces, the terrifying sounds they had made. His father had called them savages, bad men, men who killed. He whimpered, trying to press himself flatter against the ground. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the drag of something heavy through the undergrowth. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing himself. A shadow fell over him. He flinched, expecting a blow, a rough hand. Nothing came. Slowly, hesitantly, he opened his eyes. Standing over him, framed by the faint moonlight filtering through the trees, was a man. Not a settler. His face was dark, lined with pain, his long hair loose around his shoulders. He wore deerskin trousers and a simple hide tunic, and he was leaning heavily against a tree, one hand pressed to his thigh. Even in the dim light, Thomas could see the dark, spreading stain on the deerskin. A Cheyenne. One of them. Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was it. This was how it ended. He squeezed his eyes shut again, waiting for the inevitable. The man didn't move for a long moment. Thomas could hear his ragged breathing, the soft rustle of leaves as he shifted his weight. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken fear and pain. Finally, a sound, low and guttural, escaped the man's lips. It wasn't a threat, it sounded like weariness, or perhaps a question Thomas couldn't understand. He opened his eyes again. The Cheyenne man was looking down at him, his expression unreadable in the shadows. His eyes, dark and deep, seemed to hold a vast, ancient sadness that Thomas, even in his terror, somehow recognized. The man lowered himself slowly to the ground, wincing visibly as he put weight on his injured leg. He leaned back against the tree trunk, closing his eyes, his breath coming in harsh gasps. He seemed less a threat and more broken, like everything else Thomas had seen tonight. Hesitantly, Thomas pushed himself to a sitting position. The man didn't open his eyes, he just leaned there, a figure of still, wounded exhaustion in the dark woods. Thomas looked at the dark stain on his leg, saw how his hand trembled as he held it. It was a wound, a bad one, like the leg of Mr. Davy's dog after it was caught in a trap, bleeding and raw. The fear was still there, a tight knot in his stomach, but something else was stirring too, confusion. This man, one of the terrifying figures who had brought fire and death, was also hurting. He looked vulnerable. Thomas watched him for a long time. The fire in the village had died down now, leaving only the distant flickering glow against the sky. The cold was settling in, a damp, penetrating chill. He shivered, pulling his thin shirt tighter around him. The Cheyenne man shifted, his eyes fluttering open. He saw Thomas watching him. His dark gaze held no hostility, only a deep weariness. He didn't speak. Minutes crawled by. The man seemed to be conserving his strength, his breaths shallow. Thomas sat hunched in the cold, his mind numb with shock and sorrow. He was alone, utterly, terrifyingly alone. Except for the wounded man. A new thought, small and hesitant, formed in his mind. He was alone, yes, but so was the man. Wounded in the dark, probably scared too, though his face didn't show it. He remembered his mother, binding a cut on his knee, her hands gentle and warm. She had always said, "If someone is hurt, Thomas, you help them if you can." But this was one of them, one of the ones who… He looked back at the man's leg. The stain was larger now. He was bleeding. Necessity, stark and simple, began to override fear. He needed water. His throat was dry and scratchy from the smoke and crying. The man probably needed it more. He needed shelter. It was getting colder. They both did. He swallowed hard. He knew where the creek was. His father had taken him fishing there. It wasn't far, just through these trees. He got slowly to his feet, his movements hesitant. The Cheyenne man watched him, his eyes tracking the boy's every move. Thomas didn't meet his gaze directly. He just nodded, a small, jerky motion, towards the direction of the creek. The man didn't respond verbally. After a moment, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod in return. It was enough. Thomas turned and began to walk, slowly, cautiously, into the deeper woods, listening intently for the sound of running water. He didn't look back, but he could feel the man's eyes on his back. He found the creek by the sound, a faint murmur growing louder as he approached. He knelt by the bank, cupped his hands, and drank deeply, the cold water a shock to his system. He drank again, then carefully, using a large leaf as a makeshift cup, he filled his hands and carried water back towards the man. He made several trips, offering the water in his cupped hands. The man drank gratefully, his eyes closing again briefly in relief. They spent the rest of the night there, the man leaning against the tree, Thomas huddled nearby, occasionally adding small branches to a tiny, placeable, smokeless fire the man had somehow managed to start with flint and steel, hidden low to the ground. The fire offered little warmth but immense comfort, a small defiant spark against the overwhelming darkness and cold. They didn't speak. Words felt inadequate, unnecessary in the face of the night's horrors and their shared precarious existence. Observation became their language. Thomas watched the man's pained expressions, the careful way he moved his leg, the lines of exhaustion etched on his face. The man watched Thomas, the tremor in the boy's hands as he held the leaf cup, the quick, fearful glances towards the dark woods, the deep, profound sorrow in his young eyes. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in pale, bruised colors, the man stirred. He looked at his leg, tested it gently. It was swollen and stiff. Survival instincts, sharp and honed by a lifetime on the frontier, were beginning to override the pain and weariness. They couldn't stay here. He looked at Thomas. The boy was asleep, curled into a tight ball, shivering despite the small fire. He was just a child, a settler child, one whose village his people had attacked. A wave of something complex and heavy washed over Nahuel, grief for the lives lost on both sides, weary resignation at the endless cycle of violence, and a strange, unexpected stirring of pity for the small, defenseless creature who had somehow found him. He had lost children of his own. This boy's face, streaked with dirt and dried tears, awoke an ache in a place he thought had long gone numb. He needed to move. He needed to find a safer place, a place to treat his wound properly, to assess the situation. He couldn't leave the boy, not like this. It was a choice made not by logic or tribal loyalty, but by the quiet, undeniable pull of shared humanity, a bond forged in the crucible of shared catastrophe. He roused Thomas gently, a soft sound, a light touch on the shoulder. Thomas woke with a start, eyes wide with fear, until he saw the man. The fear didn't vanish, but it softened, replaced by wary uncertainty. Nahuel gestured towards the west, towards the deeper wilderness, away from the direction of the village and any potential pursuit. He spoke for the first time, his voice low and rough, using simple words he knew some settlers understood, words picked up in infrequent, tense encounters. Go. West. Safe. Thomas hesitated. Go? Alone? The thought was terrifying. But staying here, near the burnt village, was equally so. He looked from the direction the man indicated to the man's wounded leg, then back to the west. He understood. They needed to move, together. He nodded, a small, decisive movement. Nahuel managed a faint, almost imperceptible nod of approval. Getting up was a struggle. He pushed himself against the tree, biting back a groan as his leg took his weight. Thomas watched, then moved instinctively, offering a small, steadying hand against the man's arm. Nahuel paused, surprised by the gesture, then leaned on the boy for a brief moment before straightening, favoring the injured leg heavily. They began to move, a strange, mismatched pair traversing the awakening woods. Nahuel set a slow, uneven pace, relying on his knowledge of the land to find the easiest path, avoiding broken ground that would strain his leg. Thomas walked beside him, small and silent, watching the ground, occasionally glancing up at the man's face. The first few days were a blur of pain, hunger, and fear. They rationed the small amount of dried meat Nahuel carried. He taught Thomas, through gestures and simple actions, how to find edible roots and berries, how to identify tracks, how to move quietly through the trees. Thomas, in turn, helped Nahuel. He fetched water, gathered soft leaves for a makeshift bandage, helped him stand when his leg gave out. He learned to read the subtle shifts in the man's expression, the tight lines around his eyes that meant pain, the slight relaxation when he found something they could eat. Slowly, painfully, a fragile trust began to build between them. It wasn't spoken. It was in the way Nahuel didn't flinch when Thomas reached out to steady him, in the way Thomas no longer ran when Nahuel coughed or groaned in his sleep. It was in the shared silence which gradually lost its tension and became something quieter, almost comfortable. The terrible image of the painted faces, the savages his father had warned him about, began to fade, replaced by the reality of this one man, Nahuel, who was in pain and shared his dwindling food and didn't leave him alone in the vast, terrifying wilderness. One evening, huddled under a rock overhang during a cold rain, the silence was different. Thomas had been crying softly, thinking of his mother. Nahuel watched him, his dark eyes reflecting the faint firelight. He reached out a hand, slowly, hesitant. Thomas flinched back slightly, the old fear flickering. Nahuel didn't press, just left his hand resting on the ground between them. After a moment, Thomas, still sniffling, reached out his own small hand and tentatively touched the man's fingers. Nahuel's fingers were rough, calloused, but warm. He didn't pull away. Thomas leaned his head against his drawn-up knees, his hand resting on Nahuel's. The rain drummed against the rock, a lonely sound, but they were not alone. "My mama," Thomas whispered, the words thick with tears. She went away." Nahuel understood. He had seen the boy alone by the root cellar. He had seen the look in his eyes. He nodded slowly. "Gone," he murmured, the word a low rasp in his throat. "Like my own." He didn't elaborate, but the shared understanding of loss hung heavy and quiet in the air between them. Weeks passed. Nahuel's leg healed slowly, leaving him with a limp, but his strength returned. Thomas grew leaner, tougher. His initial terror gave way to a quiet resilience. He learned to fish with a crude spear Nahuel fashioned, how to track small game, how to build a simple lean-to. He still grieved, the loss a constant ache, but it was no longer a crippling weight. It was a part of him now, something he carried, but it didn't define every moment. He found small moments of quiet joy, the taste of fresh fish cooked over a fire, the sight of a deer grazing in the morning mist, the warmth of the sun after a cold night, and the comfort of the man's presence. They began to talk more. Nahuel taught him Cheyenne words, told him stories of his people, of the land, of the stars. Thomas spoke of his village, of his mother and father, of the simple life he had known. They were two lost souls, one from a world destroyed, the other from a world slowly being encroached upon and irrevocably changed, finding a fragile connection in the wild, indifferent heart of the prairie. Their journey took them south, following hidden trails known only to Nahuel. He spoke of finding a place where they could be safe, away from both the settlers and the conflict that consumed his own people. A quiet place. But the world outside their small bubble of shared existence was not quiet. One afternoon, as they rested near a small creek, they heard sounds in the distance, horses, voices. Nahuel stiffened, his hand going instinctively to the knife at his belt. "Hide," he whispered, his eyes scanning the tree line. "Quick!" They scrambled into a thicket of dense bushes, pressing themselves low to the ground. Thomas's heart began to pound, the old fear returning. He peeked through the leaves. 3 men on horseback rode into view, settlers from the look of them, armed with rifles. They were talking loudly, their voices harsh. Thomas recognized the accent. They were looking for something, or someone. "Any sign?" one of them called out. "Nothin'," another replied, spitting on the ground. "Been tracking for days. Those red devils are slick." Thomas flinched at the words. Red devils. That's what his father had sometimes called them. Prejudice, learned and unquestioned, now felt sharp and wrong in his mouth. He looked at Nahuel, huddled beside him, his face a mask of grim determination. "Heard tell some of 'em might be making their way south," the first man said. "After what they did, burnin' Harmony Creek, we gotta make 'em pay, every last one." Harmony Creek. That was his village. They were talking about his home, about the attack. These men, settlers like him, spoke of vengeance, of making every last one pay. The implication hung heavy in the air. Vengeance against anyone with dark skin and long hair. Against Nahuel. Fear warred with a new, fierce protective instinct. These men didn't know Nahuel. They didn't know he had shared his food, taught him how to survive, offered comfort when he cried. They only saw what they expected to see. Savages, killers. They couldn't find Nahuel. They wouldn't understand. They wouldn't care about the bond that had grown between them. The men dismounted near the creek, letting their horses drink. They were close. Too close. One of them walked towards the thicket where Thomas and Nahuel were hidden, scanning the bushes idly. Nahuel tensed, preparing to move, to defend, to draw the attention away from the boy if necessary. His injured leg made a clean escape impossible. Thomas saw the man approaching, saw the rifle slung casually over his shoulder. He saw the look in his eyes, hard, unforgiving, full of hate. And he saw Nahuel, wounded, ready to face impossible odds to protect him. Without thinking, acting purely on instinct, Thomas scrambled forward slightly, pushing through a gap in the bushes just enough to be seen. "Hey," he yelled, his voice small but clear, high with feigned excitement. "Look, a rabbit." The settler stopped, startled. His head whipped towards the sound. Thomas pointed frantically towards a different part of the thicket, away from Nahuel. "There, it went in there," he insisted, making sure the man got a good look at his small settler face, his dusty clothes. He was just a boy, a lost settler boy. Not with the red devils. The settler hesitated, glancing from Thomas to the spot he pointed. A rabbit wouldn't mean much, but a boy found alone could be important. More settlers, maybe. A survivor from the village. "Where'd you come from, kid?" the settler asked, suspicion still in his voice, but curiosity warring with it. From far away," Thomas stammered, trying to sound scared and lost, which wasn't hard. "I got lost. After," he trailed off, letting his voice break, mimicking the sobs that had come so easily weeks ago. He looked dirty, thin, ragged, exactly what a lost survivor might look like. The other two riders came over, their voices lowering in concern. "Kid's alone," one said. "Looks like he came from the north." The first settler knelt down, his expression softening slightly. "You from Harmony Creek, son?" Thomas nodded, unable to speak, letting fresh tears well in his eyes. It wasn't hard to cry about Harmony Creek. The settlers exchanged glances. "Poor kid," one muttered. "Must be the only one." They forgot about the rabbit, about tracking. Finding a survivor changed things. Their focus shifted to the boy, asking him his name, if he'd seen anyone else. Thomas kept his answers vague, focusing on his fear and being lost. He made sure not to look back at the thicket where Nahuel was hidden. After a few minutes, the settlers decided they couldn't leave him there. They helped him onto the back of one of the horses, awkwardly, their movements rough but not unkind. They turned back the way they had come, towards where they had camped, towards the nearest settlement. As they rode away, Thomas twisted on the horse's back, craning his neck to look back at the thicket. Through the leaves he caught a glimpse of dark eyes watching him, a single hand raised in a gesture of silent farewell. "Nahuel." A fresh wave of tears streamed down Thomas's face, not from fear or grief for his village this time, but from the wrenching pain of leaving the man who had become his protector, his companion, the only family he had left. He had saved Nahuel from being discovered, but in doing so, he had separated them. He was going back to the world of settlers, a world that would never accept Nahuel, a world that had just called him a red devil. Nahuel was going back into the wilderness, alone, wounded. They reached the settler camp that evening. Thomas was fed, given a blanket. The settlers were rough but sympathetic, full of pity for the lost boy from the burnt village. They talked about taking him to the nearest town, finding someone to care for him. They talked, too, about continuing their search, about finding the perpetrators of the attack. Thomas listened, his heart heavy, his mind fixed on the lone figure he had left behind in the woods. The next morning, before sunrise, while the settlers were still asleep, Thomas slipped away from the camp. He took a little dried meat and a knife one of the settlers had left carelessly on the ground. He knew the direction they had come from. He knew the way back to the creek. He had to go back. He had to find Nahuel. The journey back was harder alone, but Thomas was no longer the terrified lost child who had stumbled out of the burning village. He was leaner, faster, more observant. He knew how to follow the faint signs Nahuel had taught him to look for: a broken twig, a disturbed stone, a footprint in the mud. He was driven by a fierce determination, a sense of purpose he hadn't known he was capable of. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was searching. He reached the creek late in the day. The settlers' tracks were still visible, but there were no signs of Nahuel. A knot of panic tightened in his chest. Had he left? Was he gone? "Nahuel," he called out, his voice small and thin in the vastness of the woods. "Nahuel." Silence, only the sound of the creek and the wind in the trees. He sank to his knees, despair threatening to overwhelm him. Had he made the wrong choice? Had he sent Nahuel away, alone, into danger? "Nahuel," he sobbed, louder this time. And then, a sound, soft, cautious, from the opposite bank of the creek. He looked up, hope surging through him. Standing partially concealed by the trees was Nahuel. He looked thinner, weary, his legs still favored, but his eyes were bright with surprise, then something akin to wonder. Thomas scrambled across the shallow creek, not caring that his clothes were soaked. He reached the other side and ran towards the man, throwing himself at Nahuel's legs, wrapping his arms around him in a fierce hug, burying his face in the deerskin. Nahuel stood still for a moment, utterly surprised. Then, slowly, tentatively, his arms came up, big, rough hands resting gently on the boy's back. He knelt down, careful of his leg, and returned the embrace, holding the small, trembling body close. The prejudice, the tribal lines, the violence that had torn their worlds apart, in that moment, they meant nothing. There was only the man and the boy, survivors bound by shared hardship and a connection that transcended everything else. Thomas clung to him, tears flowing freely now, tears of relief, of exhaustion, of a love that had grown silently in the wilderness. "I came back," he whispered into the deerskin. "I came back for you." Nahuel held him tightly. "You came back," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. It was more than he had expected, more than he had dared to hope for. The small settler boy, who had every reason to fear and hate him, had chosen him. They stayed by the creek that night, a true reunion this time. Thomas told Nahuel about the settlers, about their talk of vengeance. Nahuel listened, his face grim. They understood, with a quiet certainty, that they could not go back to the world of men, not yet, maybe not ever. Their path lay elsewhere, deeper in the wilderness, forging a new life built on the fragile, precious foundation they had found together. Nahuel's wound needed tending again. Thomas, no longer squeamish, helped clean it with water and fresh leaves, his small hands steady and careful. As he worked, he spoke quietly, no longer bound by fear or suspicion. He talked about how scared he had been, how he had missed his mother, how the fire had been so big. Nahuel listened, sometimes adding a quiet word, sometimes just offering a steadying presence. The next day, they continued their journey, but it felt different. The fear was still there, the wilderness still vast and challenging, but they faced it together. Thomas walked beside Nahuel, sometimes helping him over rough ground, sometimes walking slightly ahead, his eyes scanning the path, imitating the man's vigilance. They were no longer two strangers forced together by circumstance. They were a unit, a small, unconventional family. They traveled for many more weeks, moving south, then west, finding secluded valleys, hidden springs, places where the land felt untouched and quiet. Nahuel taught Thomas how to hunt with a bow he crafted, how to make fire without flint, how to read the weather in the sky. Thomas, with his boundless energy and small size, was surprisingly good at tracking small game and finding resources Nahuel might miss. He also brought a lightness that had been absent from Nahuel's life, a simple joy in small things that was infectious. They built a small, sturdy cabin by a clear lake, hidden in a valley overlooked by high peaks. It was simple, made of logs and mud and woven branches, but it was theirs. It was a home forged from ash and sorrow, built by hands that had once belonged to worlds that saw each other only as enemies. Life was hard. There were lean times, harsh winters, the constant awareness of their isolation. But there was also peace. The quiet rhythm of the seasons, the beauty of the wild landscape, the deep, abiding connection they shared. Thomas grew taller, his face losing the haunted look of the survivor, and gaining the open, watchful gaze of someone who knew the wilderness intimately. He still spoke of his parents, his voice soft with remembrance, but his memories were no longer solely wrapped in grief. They were a part of the story he carried, the story that had led him here, to this valley, to this man. One evening, sitting by the fire outside their cabin, watching the stars fill the impossibly black sky, Thomas leaned his head against Nahuel's side. He wasn't a small child anymore, but a boy on the cusp of adolescence. "Thank you, Nahuel," he said quietly. Nahuel put an arm around his shoulders, pulling him closer. He didn't need to ask what for saving him from the fire, for not leaving him in the woods, for teaching him, protecting him, loving him like his own, for being his home. "We are," Nahuel said, using the Cheyenne word for together, "we are." They had lost everything: village, family, way of life. They had come from worlds defined by conflict and hatred. But in the shared crucible of tragedy, amidst the ashes of what was, they had found each other. They had built a home not just of logs and stone, but of trust, resilience, and love. It was a bond that the world, with all its prejudice and violence, could not break. They were survivors, yes, but more than that, they were family. An unbreakable bond forged in tragedy, shining like a quiet star in the vast, dark wilderness they now called their own.